Okay, so continuing on from the previous video, in this video we're going to build together our compositing asset for compositing asset. So we've already got our main spotlights for our set in place along with their shadows, and all we really need to now bring in for our set are the secondary spotlights. And the secondary spotlights conveniently have diffuse, specular and shadow, so we can make use of our diffuse, specular and shadow asset we've built to very quickly bring in the diffuse, specular and shadow passes for our secondary spotlights and then combine them together with our main spotlights. First off, I'm going to rename our existing asset over to main spots, since these are dealing with our main spots. And then I'm going to push tab and come down to our digital assets folder and create a new diffuse, specular and shadow asset, which I'll rename to secondary spots. So let's bring our visibility down here, and we've got it set so far to our main spotlight passes, but we can quickly browse to find our new passes. So our diffuse sequence, we're going to jump and grab our secondary spots diffuse sequence. Our specular sequence, we want to grab these secondary spots specular. And for our shadow sequence, we want to grab the secondary spots shadow sequence. Again, all of this is for shot 2. So now that we have those in place, if we scrub, we should eventually see, there we go, shadows coming in from our character being cast by those secondary spotlights. I will boost up our diffuse intensity slightly. Fantastic. We can just about make out some shadows. So how do we go about combining these two lights together? Well, it's really rather simple. In the renderer, when we have multiple light sources, we simply add together those light sources, and we're going to do the same in compositing. And we can think about this in terms of, let's say we had something that we had a spotlight illuminating. In the real world, had a spotlight illuminating. If we brought another spotlight in and illuminated the same area, that area is going to be twice as bright as long as those lights are identical. Because we got the light from the first spotlight, and now we got the light from the second spotlight adding even more light energy. So we can see this in the renderer when we have our two main spotlights and where they overlap. On either of the spotlights where it's just one spotlight, we have about half the intensity of that overlapped area. In the same way, when we come to combine our main spotlights along with our secondary spotlights, we can simply add them together, and we've already seen in the previous video that we do have an add cop that we could use. So I'm going to push tab and drop in an add cop, and I'm going to add our main spots to our secondary spots, and we can see the end result of that. Now again, we need to be careful here with our alpha channels, much like when we were screening. We need to make sure that we don't affect our alpha channels with this add, because we don't want to get harsh, sharp alphas on the basically outsides of our objects. And with this, I'm going to rename this to add main spots, secondary spots. So main spots, secondary spots. And really, that's all there is to compositing our set. We've got our main spots, we've got our secondary spots, and we've got the shadows for both. So with these in place, we can grab all three of these nodes, Shift C to collapse these down into a subnet, and we can rename this subnet to setComp. Now again, we need to make sure we're careful with which node inside our subnet is getting rendered out. Let's jump inside. And we can see that it wasn't our add, in fact it was just our main spot. So let's jump down and set the render flag on our add main spots, secondary spots, so when we jump back out, that's what we're seeing here at the asset level. So I'm going to right click and create a digital asset from this subnet, and I will name this to set comp, just being picky, but I want a capital C on the comp, and we're going to put this in our compositing.otl file. So I'm going to bring up our browser and put this inside our compositing.otl. So if we accept this, and all the parameters that we have already exist on those two assets, along with now we have basically overall control of adding together the two lights, because on the add we also have a foreground weight and a background weight, much like the screen. So I'm going to bring up the type properties, and I'm going to choose to create parameters from nodes. Let's just give us some more room to work with here. So I'm going to create parameters from nodes, go inside our setComp, and let's first go on to our main spots. And I'm going to promote up our diffuse sequence, specular sequence, shadow sequence, the separator, the diffuse, specular, and shadow intensity from our main spots, and promote those over. Why did that only promote the separator? Let's try that again. Grab these, it's exploded. Hang on a second. Let's try clicking and dragging these over. There we go. That's going to promote those over nicely, but not the separator apparently. This is fantastic. Hang on a second. So let's go by type and create a separator in between. So I've promoted up, even though it wasn't the way I'd have liked to have promoted them up, I've promoted up our 3 sequences and our intensity values. But since we're going to be bringing up the 3 sequences and intensity values for our secondary spotlights as well, it would make sense to create a folder to keep these guys in. So I'm going to rename this folder to main spotlights, and I'm going to put all of these parameters inside that folder. You also notice that I forgot to uncheck the prefix link name and label. That's not a problem. I'm simply going to come in and just change our label to remove the prefix that we created. So let's just delete out main spots from all of our labels. Similarly with our intensity, there we go. Similarly with our secondary spotlights, I'm going to create a folder which I'll name to secondary spotlights, and I will make sure to turn off prefix link name and label, and we can go back over to from nodes, and we can jump inside our secondary spots instance of that asset and grab the diffuse down to our intensity. I'm going to click and drag that over into our secondary spotlights. Again, it didn't want to take the separator, so let's just manually drag that out. And again, I obviously, when I created the asset, missed off the ITY on the shadow intensity. That's not to worry. So now we've got diffuse sequence, specular sequence, and shadow sequence of both main spotlights and secondary spotlights, and their relative intensities. If we accept this, we can see that we now have a main spotlights and a secondary spotlights folder with control over the diffuse and our shadows for both the main spotlights and our secondary spotlights. You can just make it out. Probably when it's encoded, we probably won't make that out. Let's see if we can find where they're more obvious. I guess if we kill our diffuse intensity on the main spotlights, you can again just about make those out. What we also have though down inside our asset are the foreground and background weights, where we can say I don't want any of our foreground weight. And what's our foreground weight? All of our main spotlights combined, diffuse, specular and shadow. Or I don't want any of the background weight, and that's all of our secondary spotlights combined, diffuse, specular and shadow. So we could think of this as being an overall intensity for that light. If we were to set our light to be off, we could simply set its intensity to 0. It wouldn't be emitting diffuse, it wouldn't be emitting specular, and it wouldn't be emitting shadow. So I'm going to jump up, I'm going to right click and bring up our type properties, and I'm going to promote up those 2 parameters as overall intensities for both our main spotlights and our secondary spotlights. So the foreground weight again was dealing with the main spotlights, so I'm going to right click, export parameter to type properties. I'm going to drop that into the main spotlights folder above our diffuse intensity and give this a name of main spots overall intense, and I'll give this a label of overall intensity. I'll do the same with our background weight, so I'll right click on background weight and export parameter to type properties. I'll give this a name of secondary spots overall intense with a label of overall intensity, and I'll put this inside our secondary spots folder above our diffuse intensity. So now if we accept this and jump back out, we now have control over the overall intensity for a particular light, or we can control the diffuse intensity for that light, the specular intensity for that light, or the shadows, and we have both our main spotlights and our secondary spotlights, which are all of the passes that we have for our set. So with that, I'm going to right click, save out our operator, and right click match current definition, and OK through that error. That was a kind of weird error. There we go. Doing that a second time seemed to make that work fine, so I'm not quite sure what Houdini was complaining about. So now we've got our set asset in place, which is going to provide extremely useful, because this can be a building block for one of our other assets for our character. So with this video, we've wrapped up our set asset. Thanks a lot.